Now, as we think about keeping lectures engaging, let's look at some things to avoid and some things you should include. And when I talk about lectures here, remember I'm including any form of direct instruction where the teacher is delivering content to the students, as opposed to things like a discovery approach, a project-based approach, that type of thing. You know, we tend to think of the word lecture in the context of high school and college, but even elementary classes have direct instruction, like the teacher conducting a Bible lesson. So these things apply to all those forms of direct instruction, whether or not you think of it as a traditional lecture. Now, I also don't think that any of us here would give what would be considered a true lecture. That is, 50 minutes straight of just talking, like in a college lecture hall or a sermon where you talk and everyone just listens. I mean, we innately know that we need some type of interaction during class, but the ways we often go about it might lead to student disengagement, or at least they don't help student engagement. So first, let's talk about some things that you should avoid. Now, I'm not saying never do these, but your instruction should typically avoid these practices because they tend to lessen student engagement. First, teachers often have a lot of rhetorical questions in their lectures. Okay, so you're talking about the book of Acts, for example. You say, so why did Paul go to Macedonia? It was because the Holy Spirit told him to. And why did the Holy Spirit send him there? It was to spread the gospel into new lands. Notice there was no pause after the questions because you weren't expecting anyone to answer. You don't even wait for an answer. You give the answer yourself. We tend to do this type of approach with the rhetorical questions because we want the students to be thinking, and asking a question we believe gets them thinking. But when you typically follow through just by asking rhetorical questions, the students get to the point where they're not thinking about those questions. They're not expected to answer, so they don't think about it. And when you say, so why did Paul go to Macedonia? The students know you're going to immediately tell them why Paul went to Macedonia, so mentally they don't have to think it through. And then what happens is, when you do want them to answer, you have to tell them explicitly. You have to say something like, okay, I want you to answer here. Why didn't Paul go to China? You see, the use of a lot of rhetorical questions actually conditions our students not to think about what you're saying in the questions, because you're asking something and turning around and giving them the answer so they don't have to think. By the way, when we say, does anyone have any questions? That's practically a rhetorical question, because really almost no student is going to say, yes, I've got a question. If you really want to check understanding, you need to do it differently, and we'll talk later about that. But that's the issue of formative feedback. But the point here is to avoid this overuse of rhetorical questions. Asking obvious or too easy questions is also a way that leads to student engagement. Remember, engagement involves students using their minds to actively process information. When you ask an obvious question, though, they don't have to think to answer. Now, what do I mean by obvious questions? Okay, you're in a high school math class and you say, okay class, what's 2 plus 2? Or you ask the same thing to a 5th grade math class. Or you ask your 3rd grade class, what does the cat say? I mean, these are all way too easy, and you'll rarely get responses. The students feel insulted, or they think you must be trying to trick them. They're thinking, okay, 2 plus 2 is 4. The teacher must have something else he's after, so I'm not going to answer and look foolish. You see, you want them to use their minds and not just say something and not just sit there. Now, another type of obvious question is to have them say something that's in their book or on the PowerPoint. Okay, so you have your high school class look up John 3:16. They're looking at it in their Bibles, and then you say, okay, God so loved the what? That he gave his only begotten what? You know, it's right there in front of them. They're high schoolers. They can read, and they think, why is he asking? It's right here. Okay. Just the act of responding doesn't do anything. Or you're in a middle school history class and you put the first line of the Declaration of Independence up on your PowerPoint. And you say, "We hold these truths to be..." What? Class, it's here on the slide. "We hold these truths to be..." See, they're looking at it. It's right there on the slide. They can read it. You can read it. You're not getting real engagement just by making them read the text to you. Of course, if you ask too difficult questions, that also leads to a lack of engagement. I mean, if you ask a first grade class to explain the Pythagorean theorem, you're not going to get student engagement there. But that's generally not our problem. We tend to ask questions that are too easy, that are obvious, and students don't engage with that. Your questions need to be on an appropriate level. Now, this next one my pastor pointed out, asking questions that involve reading the teacher's mind. Okay, you're studying the Civil War and you say, okay, what was a turning point in the Civil War? Now, maybe it's the Battle of Vicksburg, the burning of Atlanta, or any number of other things. Unless you're explicitly wanting the students to generate a list, though, they can't know what you're thinking of until you would say, well, I was thinking of the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, if you just explicitly taught that Gettysburg was the main turning point in the war, then you can ask that. But otherwise, your students need to read your mind to know what you're getting at. Often, we tend to do this when we're introducing a new topic. You might say, today we're going to study a composer who was the greatest in the classical era. Who was that? Now, you might be thinking of Mozart, but they might answer, well, Haydn, or Salieri, or Beethoven. And so you end up having to say, well, no, I wasn't thinking of it. It's before him or after him, or this one, you start having to get hints for them to come to what you're thinking of. Now, here's what happens when you do this. Students start thinking that there's no way they can know the answers to your questions. Or they feel like they're too dumb to answer, so they just quit answering and quit thinking. Again, we want our students to engage their minds, not tune out. Now, if you use PowerPoint, there are some problems to avoid. One is having too much text on your slides. If you find that your PowerPoint is almost exclusively bullet points, like 5 or more per slide, and those points take 2 lines each, you've got too much text. Now remember what we said in the session on taking notes. If you want the students to have exact words in their notes, then just give them the notes rather than having them copy them down. Rote copying does nothing for student engagement. Now, an exception to this might be when you're actually going to discuss a particular text. Maybe you put up the first few lines of Hamlet's famous soliloquy and you use that to discuss the meaning with the students, all the while emphasizing words or phrases on the slides. But if you're not focusing on some specific text for discussion, then don't put it on the slide. See, here's the problem. We can't read and listen at the same time. If you've got a lot of text on the slide, like with your bullet points, and then you start talking about it, the students are reading the slide and not really hearing what you're saying. If you really want them to read more than just a few words, then put the text up, give them a few moments to read it themselves, and then talk about it. Related to this, don't just read your slides to them. If you have a point to make, don't just put text on the PowerPoint and then read it to them. That's boring and insulting. They can read it themselves and they can read it faster than you can speak it. Actually, your slides should be more graphics oriented rather than text oriented. Notice what I'm doing in this video. I've got a picture that's related to the content and just a couple of words or text to focus the main point. And PowerPoint is essentially a visual medium, and it's most effective for pictures and graphics, not text. Now, these are just a couple of elements of giving an effective PowerPoint presentation in general. There's much more we could talk about with effective PowerPoints, not just the design of the PowerPoint, but how you present it, and we can't go into that here. But you should look up tips for effective PowerPoint presentations online, because if you're using PowerPoint in your lecture, in your direct instruction, you need to present it effectively. Finally, you need to avoid lecturing too long without some type of break or diversion or some type of alternative activity. Now, we've mentioned this before. Our short-term memory can only handle new information for about 10 to 12 minutes before it overloads. At that point, your mind needs an opportunity to process and store that information. If you just keep doing an information dump for 50 minutes straight, your students' minds are going to shut down. Well, those are some things you should not do. In the next session, we're going to see some things you should include in your lectures.